Hello ladies, gentlemen, and persons in between. My name is Tim Snowborn, and today we're talking about small government on this American Values edition of Serious Issues. So last time we talked about a liberal value, that being the separation of church and state. So it's time to talk about a conservative value. And as always, what I like to do is see if there's any crossover, any places that we agree, and then see if there's any contrary evidence. I want to see if there's any evidence to support the idea that conservatives are against small government and for big government. Is there any evidence to suggest that liberals are for small government and against big government? As far as common ground, I don't think there's a lot here. I think liberals and conservatives agree that the government should defend us against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we generally agree that the government should create and enforce laws, but that's about it. The debate over the size of the government is really a debate about what you think the government should and should not be responsible for. I do think that liberals want the government to be bigger than conservatives do, but I think it's a myth that conservatives want the government to be small. When I say small government, that means a government with minimal rules and regulations, a government that doesn't really tell you what you can't do or have to do, versus a big government where there are lots of rules and regulations and the government is responsible for doing this or doing that and other things that the conservatives think the government shouldn't be in charge of. Conservatives and liberals want the government to be in charge of different things and don't want the government to be in charge of different things. So that said, is there any evidence to suggest that liberals are against big government? Well, that's just another way of saying, is there anything the liberals think that the government should stay out of? And the answer is yes, of course there is. As a general rule, liberals want the government to stay out of our private lives, particularly in the bedroom. We typically don't want the government deciding what consenting adults can and cannot do behind closed doors. I was going to say that we don't want the government to decide when life begins, but that's sort of a dodgy situation there. Technically, the government has decided when life begins. Really, what we want is for science to tell us when life begins, or maybe philosophers, although science is going to give you a more reliable, concrete answer, whereas philosophers will just give you an endless debate and never agree on anything. We want the government to be small when it comes to drug laws, of course. I mean, personally, I think there are some drugs that definitely should be banned. I wouldn't legalize them all, but there are some drugs that we think it should be up to us. I mean, we let people drink alcohol and that kills thousands of people every year, so we should jolly well have the right to do a few drugs that don't kill anyone. We don't want the government to infringe on our right to free speech unless it's what we call hate speech. While I'm no fan of censorship, I do think we should clamp down on speech that inspires violence or encourages oppression. Now, is there any evidence to suggest that conservatives favor a big government? That is to say, is there anything that conservatives think the government should definitely be involved in? Well, it's kind of the opposite of what I said about the liberals. Many conservatives do seem to think that the government should be involved in what goes on behind closed doors between consenting adults. Conservatives also kind of want the government to decide when life begins. They just want the government to decide that life begins at conception. Conservatives also want the government to decide what we can and can't put into our bodies. I think conservatives don't like the government infringing on their right to free speech, but a lot of what conservatives want to say is considered hateful by the left. I think what conservatives really mean, though, when they talk about having a small government, is that they want fewer laws and regulations. They don't like the government telling them what they cannot or have to do. Conservatives long for the days when you didn't need a license to go fishing, for example. They remember when you used to be able to just go to the nearest body of water and fish, and you didn't need approval from the government to do that. It's strange, though, how the party that used to be all about law and order and getting tough on crime also wants fewer laws and regulations. I suspect that a lot of the contempt for regulations comes from big business. Big business doesn't like regulations, and we've talked about this before. Conforming to regulations means that they lose money because they have to spend money to conform to those regulations. Big business especially does not want the government telling them what they can and cannot do. Big business does not like having to spend the extra money to use better materials that aren't poisonous and won't hurt consumers. I agree with James Carville when he said that Republicans want a small government for the same reason crooks want fewer cops. It's easier to get away with murder. As I've said before, I realize that regulations can be onerous and heavy-handed, but I'd rather err on the side of too much regulation than not enough. And speaking of having too much or not enough of something, it seems like conservatives haven't considered that a government that is too small is just as bad as a government that is too big. I understand conservatives' fears about the downsides of a big government, and conservatives seem to assume that all governments turn bad eventually. That isn't true, of course. There are lots of big governments around the world that don't oppress and enslave their people. But I still think that a government that is too small is just as bad. A government that is too small leads to anarchy, and anarchy is very appealing to the libertarian wing of the GOP, but it's not very practical and can be just as destructive as an oppressive tyrannical regime. Liberals are more likely to trust the government because we don't trust the free market. We don't trust a bunch of carnivore capitalists and self-interested billionaires. Yes, we know the government can be bad. The government can be evil and oppressive. We especially know that today. So that's going to be all for this week. Tell me what you think. Do you think that Republicans really want a small government? Do you think that liberals want a small government? Do you think they both want the government to be about the same size and they just disagree about what the government should and should not be in charge of? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you very much for joining me for this conversation. If this is your first time on my channel, welcome. It's great to have you here. I'd love to have you subscribe and join me for future conversations and check out my previous videos for more. If you're a current subscriber, welcome back. Thank you very much for tuning in again. I appreciate your continued support. Thank you. See you next week, everyone. Take care.